Yes.
It does look kind of blurry.
So I'm really excited about it.
I haven't seen it.
It's time to go ahead and begin tonight.
I know.
It is 7 o'clock.
Yes. Sorry.
I'll be leading our singing tonight. If you want to go ahead and mark your book, later on the Song of Invitation will be 939. That will be the song for the invitation later on. And after you have that marked, if you want to go to 590, Jesus is all the world to me. We'll sing the first and the third verse. Jesus is all the world to me, my life, my joy, my all. He is my strength from day to day. Without him I would fall. When I am sad, to him I go. No other one can cheer me so. When I am sad, he makes me glad. He's my friend. Jesus is all the world to me. I want no better friend. I trust him now, I'll trust him when life's fleeting days shall end. Beautiful life with such a friend. Beautiful life that has no end. Eternal life, eternal joy. He's my friend. Tim's going to lead us in prayer.
Dear Almighty God, we thank you so much for this great nation that we live in, that we can come to you, worship you, and sing praises to you, to pray to you, to just be here together. Dear Lord, we thank you so much for the opportunity we have tonight to open up your word, to look into what can make us better, not just personally, but also for the world to see the light in us that you shine through. Dear Lord, we thank you so much for Art and his dedication to study your word, to prepare lessons, to be able to come and to portray them to us. Lord, as we open up your word tonight, we ask that our ears be open and our hearts be open. And we'll be open up to learning new things, and maybe even learning some things that we may have forgotten. Dear Lord, we thank you so much for this opportunity. It's in your son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. I'd like to invite you to open up to Luke chapter 5. Luke chapter 5 tonight. We're going to finish up the chapter, and then we're going to go into chapter 6. We're in the midst of a study on the life of Jesus, and we're doing somewhat of a harmony of the Gospels, although not in the truest sense of the word, because we are emphasizing Luke. I think Luke serves as a good basis because he includes so much. We covered some of these verses last week, but we barely discussed them. So if someone wants to take verses 34 all the way through the end of the chapter, 39. Luke chapter 5, 34 through 39.
And he said unto them, Can you make the children of the bride chamber fast, while the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom shall be taken away from them, and then shall they fast in those days. And he spake also a parable unto them, No man putteth a piece of a new garment upon an old. If otherwise, then both the new maketh a rent, and the piece that was taken out of the new agreeth not with the old. And no man putteth new wine into old bottles, else the new wine will burst the bottles and be spilled, and the bottles shall perish. But new wine must be put into new bottles, and both are preserved. No man also, having drunk old wine straightway, desireth new, for he saith, the old is better.
Out with the old and in with the new. Jesus, in verses 34 and 35, talks about fasting. And I feel like that's a neglected Bible subject that's not taught much on today. We also read of fasting in Matthew chapter 6 in the Sermon on the Mount. And he talks about fasting and not fasting for the sake of man's recognition, but fasting between you and God alone. It's about that personal relationship between you and God. He mentions here the idea of a bridegroom. And that denotes images of a wedding feast. And as you all know, weddings are times of celebration, times of joy, especially in the East. I've been to India and I've seen how that they will celebrate a wedding. And it's not just a one-day affair. It's an ongoing celebration that sometimes will last for a week or more. And so on this occasion, Jesus is talking about, I'm the bridegroom. And of course, that also, we're not going to go into it, but that conjures up verses in the Old Testament as well, Jesus being the bridegroom. And he says, I'm the bridegroom, and this is not a time of mourning and reflection, not a time of repentance in the sense of fasting being related to that. But he's saying this is a time of rejoicing in the presence of the bridegroom. Rejoicing because the Messiah has come. And then he mentions in verse 35 that the bridegroom will be taken away. Now, most commentaries will say that is referring to him being crucified. But I think it also applies to us today. Now, the Jews took fasting and they tagged on tradition to it. And they made it very ritualistic. And Jesus, of course, condemns all those traditions and how they really took the true meaning of what fasting was out of it by all the traditions. But Christians today should consider fasting, not because it's a fad diet, but in a spiritual sense. We're not required to, we're not commanded to, but it's something to give thought to. Now, you might say, well, why, Art? Why would you even make a statement like that? Because the whole point of it is setting aside time, devotional time between you and God alone. That's the whole point of it. Not being distracted by food, not being distracted by anything else, but just focusing and devoting your thoughts, your mind directly on God. And that's definitely a good thing. So it's just something to consider. Again, we're not commanded to. We don't read a whole lot in the New Testament about it, although we can read a little bit more about it in the Old Testament. But we know that the early Christians did it. And we know they did it, of course, in biblical times. Any questions, thoughts, comments?
Well, this is relating. It can relate to us even more because the next verse talks about there's going to be a time when the bridegroom's not there, and that's referring to Christ. When
Verse 35.
He's going to go back to heaven instead of the Father. But that's referring to us now. Anytime that Jesus isn't on the earth, and you hear that in Scripture, that's referring to us. I mean, there's another time. I think Thomas, John Thomas, he said the same thing. He says, "Blessed are those who do not see the Christ." That's referring to us.
Right.
So there's that speaks right to us.
Good point. Tiffany?
I was just wondering, I know that fasting consists of meditating and focusing on God, but also when you speak of fasting, what does that also consist of?
Not eating.
Not eating.
And it's letting your hunger remind you of what you're doing. Okay, so if you go for an extended period of time, you're gonna get hungry. But you're doing it for a purpose.
Right.
It's a purposeful thing, and that hunger should remind you, okay, I am focused on something here.
Right.
I'm doing this for a reason.
And the reason then for me asking is because I have a cousin that always talks about fasting. And
well, here's one word of caution is just like the Pharisees, and Jesus, of course, is addressing the Pharisees here. It can become overblown. It can become overemphasized. The whole point of it is for the spiritual benefit, being close to God. And if we place emphasis on the act itself or the ritual side of it, like many even do today, then it loses its whole point, the whole meaning of it.
And the Scripture declares when you fast, Look like you do normally. Don't go out.
Yeah, in Matthew 6, like we referred to a minute ago. Yeah. Don't do it for attention from men.
Right.
Go ahead, Luke.
I always mention the Pharisees' closet. They would have a section in their closet of a tattered robe to show that they had been fasting.
Go ahead, Eric.
When you finish fasting, you do satisfy your hunger, you can be reminded God provides for you as well.
Sure.
In that sense.
Yep, very good point. Any other comments? I wanted to touch on this because it's not talked about a whole lot. All right, and then in verses 36 through 38, he uses two vivid illustrations. He uses the illustration of, let's see, what's the first one here? He uses the illustration of new garments and old garments. You don't want to take a patch from an old garment and put it on a new garment, because that new garment hasn't shrunk yet. It hasn't worn in. It hasn't changed its shape. And we all know sometimes we'll buy, let's say, a medium shirt that fits us, and then we wash it a few times in water that's maybe a little too hot, and it shrinks up on us. And how did this medium shirt become a small shirt? Well, it shrunk. And Jesus is using a common illustration that they would understand. You don't want to take a new or an old patch and put it on a new garment, or vice versa even, because it's going to tear away from one another. And the Pharisees and the Jews, they had all these traditions. And as we said last week, maybe the intent behind the tradition was good, but it had evolved into something that was wrong. It had evolved into something that actually overshadowed the law itself. And Jesus is saying, I'm bringing in the new. This is a new system. We're not mixing old and new together. We're out with the old and in with the new, as I said a minute ago. And then he mentions the idea of wineskins, putting new wine into old wineskins. Now, we all know that wine has to ferment, and with that there are gases, and those gases expand. Those wineskins were stretchable because they were animal wineskins, and once they had stretched out, their elasticity had gone. And he's saying you don't want to put new wine that has not fermented and expanded, and those that gas process hasn't happened yet. You don't want to put that new wine into old wineskins because there's no more stretch left. What you're going to have is a mess on your hands that you're going to have to clean up. And so he's just basically saying it would be a catastrophe if we mix the old traditions of Judaism and the old traditions of the Pharisees and mix that with the new. And of course we know that Jesus came to fulfill the old law, not to keep it around. Think of the old law and Jesus fulfilling the old law as a contract. Are you still under a contract once it's been fulfilled? No, you're done with it. If you have a note on your car and you finish making the payments, you don't have to keep making the payments on that car. You're no longer bound to the legal obligations of the contract. Same with the mortgage. Jesus fulfilled the purpose and the intent of the old law. And so that old law had been done away with. They were no longer under that. And of course the New Testament speaks at length about that. But notice verse 39. Here's the attitude of the Pharisees. But the old is better. The old is better. The old ways are better. That's what they were saying. No one who, having drunk the old, immediately desires the new, for he says the old is better. And that was the big problem. And you can understand it. The Jews had to cling to their culture for so long to maintain their national identity. Many times they were in captivity, and the only way, of course, to remain Jews was to cling to that culture and into those traditions. Well, here comes the Messiah, and he brings in a new kingdom. It's going to be hard to teach that old dog new tricks. And that's what we see throughout the New Testament. Any comments, questions, thoughts, Luke?
Yeah, some of the Jews today, they have tried to actually, apply some of Jesus' teachings into the old ways now. We even see, some Jews that don't do sacrifice anymore. They go more spiritual route with things.
There are these religious groups that pop up that claim to be Christian, but they blend elements today of the Old Testament and the law of Moses.
Messianic Judaism.
Yeah, Messianic Judaism. There's another group that's even breaking away from them. I've had encounters in this area with. You're exactly right, though. And it's weird because, like Lou was talking about, they won't take it all. They recognize that Christ is the Messiah, but they will take just like we see in denominationalism, they will take, like it's a buffet line, and they'll pick and choose what they want or what they think is appropriate. I have a few comments here I think are applicable to this. The Jews and the Pharisees were continually seeking to justify themselves through legal tradition. You'll see the phrase, they justified themselves, over and over and over pop up throughout the gospel accounts. And that's the old here. The new, Christ was ushering in a new system of salvation by grace through faith. And faithfulness, of course, is attached to the idea of faith. And the law, the purpose of the law of Moses was given to intensify man's realization that his only hope was through a better system. And we'll see that later on. Any comments, questions, thoughts? Moving on to chapter 6. So if someone will take the first 6 verses, I will appreciate that very much.
Now it happened on the second Sabbath after the first, that he went through the grain fields, and his disciples plucked the heads of grain and ate them, rubbing them in their hands. And some of the Pharisees said to them, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" But Jesus answering them said, "Have you not even read this, what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he went into the house of God, took and ate the showbread, and also gave some to those with him, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he said to them, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath."
Go ahead and stop there, too. Thank you. So here it is, the Sabbath day. And the whole point of these next 2 events is that verse 5, what's said in verse 5, that the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath, that Jesus has authority over the Sabbath day. You can also read of these accounts in Mark chapter 2 and in Matthew chapter 12. And actually, those accounts give us details the other accounts do not. And we'll refer to those. We may even turn over there. I left my notes at home, but I have a lot of it in my brain. But let's see how it all comes out when I speak. Now, it happened on the second Sabbath after the first that he went through the grain fields. Now, you might be wondering to yourself, what business do Jesus' disciples have picking grain? Is it their grain field? If you read the text, it doesn't seem to indicate that it was their grain field. So don't think of it in terms as we would today. Today we have private property signs, no trespassing signs, and if I went into your farm and started picking your crops, you would accuse me of stealing. But if you go back and you read the law of Moses, you find out, for example, I think it's Deuteronomy 23, 24 through 25. Again, that's Deuteronomy 23, verses 24 through 25. That God allowed that society, the law, the Jews, is, here's a good example. Remember in the case of Ruth, how that Ruth was allowed to go behind those who harvested and pick up the leftovers that had fallen behind? And actually, God had given instructions in the law of Moses that they were to kind of leave the corners for the poor, for the widows. And certainly Ruth fits that description. Well, God also gave instructions in Deuteronomy, like I just mentioned, that they could go through another person's field, but they couldn't take an instrument. They couldn't go in and harvest. They couldn't go in with a sickle and farm instruments and go start harvesting someone's field. But let's say you're passing through someone's field and you're a little hungry. You can take up the fruit and eat it. Again, you're not to take a sack with you and start filling it up with apples. But in this case, it's the Sabbath day. The disciples were with Jesus. They were hungry. And they satisfy that hunger. I'm trying to remember all my comments on this. Now, first of all, Jesus was a busy person, so it shouldn't be surprising that they've not had time to eat. This seems kind of an impromptu thing here. But what's a little humorous, one of the commentaries written by a brother in Christ, a member of the church, pointed this out. He mentioned, it was the Truth for Today commentary, that it's almost a humorous scene that's taking place. The Pharisees always went around in their long robes, very, very fancy, very formal. And here they must have been following Jesus' disciples around. And in the commentary, the brother pointed out, it's almost like they're hiding out in the field just to see what Jesus' disciples would do. Could you imagine how ridiculous that would have looked? Aha! We found you! Look, you're eating grain on the Sabbath day. Now, what was God's actual rule about what not to do on the Sabbath day? To work. That's exactly right. You can read about that in the Ten Commandments. Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. They're not to work on the Sabbath day. Now, the question is, what classified as work? Depending on who you ask, right? The Pharisees here thought that them, by rubbing their hands, because the grain it's talking about here had a husk on it. You couldn't eat that husk. So you had to peel away the husk. And so they'd rub their hands together and get rid of the old husk, and they'd throw away the chaff and eat the grain. According to the Pharisees' logic, you couldn't even peel a banana or skin an apple because that would be too much work. It wasn't wrong to eat on the Sabbath day, but you can't rub your hands together. That's considered threshing. Threshing is this laborious effort where the farmers go in and they go through this process of getting the chaff away from the grain. That's real work. But you just rubbing it together. That's also threshing and processing that grain. No, it wasn't. They were just eating. And obviously, you see here in this text that they have Jesus' approval. It's not like Jesus condemned them for what they were doing. So it goes back to what we just said. What classifies as work? Now, as we mentioned before, the Pharisees had all kinds of traditions. According to one source I have, they had something like 39 different categories of what constituted work on the Sabbath day. And who knows what all that included? I don't have all the references up here. But the thing to keep in mind is in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 24 through 25, it tells you that they were allowed to pick the grain, right? As long as they didn't use a farm instrument on it. They were to glean from it, to pick it. If that's the case, that can't be considered work. You know why? Because work would be harvesting. If I'm trying to formulate my thoughts. I've got them straight in my head. It's just hard to verbalize them. If what they were doing was considered true work, then they would be stealing that man's crops. But it wasn't. It wasn't considered that by God. So therefore, it wasn't really considered true work. And so Jesus is the one that's qualified to interpret. That's what he means when he says that he is Lord of the Sabbath. He is the one that's qualified to determine what's work and what's not work on the Sabbath day. Jesus isn't here, as some have concluded, and I've heard this argued in denominational circles. Some say, well, here Jesus approves disobeying God's law on occasion. Situational ethics. There are some circumstances where we're allowed to break God's law because look at Jesus. He's allowing his disciples to work on the Sabbath day. That's not what Jesus is doing here. These disciples aren't working. They're just eating. All right, Ty, then Luke, and I think Terry, didn't you have a comment too? Or go ahead, Ty.
You remind me of a pretty extreme illustration in New York where I live. If I go and visit my friends in the hospital on Saturday, there will be a Sabbath elevator that is designated because the Jewish residents in New York, if they're observant, will not push the buttons because that's considered work. So this particular elevator stops at every floor. You just get on and you ride it until you get off.
Wow.
That's very interesting.
It is.
But yet walking into the elevator is not considered work. All right, Luke and then Dane.
Going back to your other point there about the Pharisees tracking down Jesus and trying to catch him at something. They could have been 10 other poor people who came by the same farm and gleaned like they were supposed to. So I mean, they were just out to get Jesus. I mean, that's all this is.
Oh, that's exactly what it is, Luke. You're exactly right. They're trying to find some excuse to parade Jesus in front of the Sanhedrin and condemn him to death. They're trying to find some excuse to stop Jesus, to silence Jesus. Now, Jesus gives reasoning here on why he did not violate the Sabbath. Now, the first one's very interesting. He mentions how David ate the showbread when he was hungry, and he gave it to his companions to eat. Now, that clearly is a violation, because David is from the tribe of Judah. He's not a priest. Only the priest could eat the showbread. But David ate it. Now, Jesus isn't approving of what David did here, but the Jews never condemned David for doing that. So they're letting David off the hook. But here, someone greater than David has come onto the scene, the Lord of the Sabbath, Jesus the Messiah, of the seed and lineage of David, and he's just broken their tradition, what they perceive to be a violation. Technically, they haven't, and it wasn't even him, it was his disciples. But the point I'm trying to make is he's saying, look, David did something, and you're okay with that. Now you're finding fault in me for doing this, or my disciples? Go ahead, Michael.
I have a question. I don't have my regular Bible, so I can't look this up. Do you recall, did the law say the showbread shall be eaten by the priest, and did it then say, and it shall not be eaten by anyone else? Is it one of those silence of the scriptures things?
I don't know. I don't have the record on that.
Okay.
That's a good question, though. And maybe we can reflect back on that next week when we come back. Let's see. So in Matthew and Mark's account, let's go over there real quick. If I had my notes with me, I'd be able to tell you what these verses say, but I don't. Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. We won't go and read it all, but I do want to point out the differences. Notice verse 5. It says, have you not read in the law on the Sabbath that the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Did the priests have to go into the temple on the Sabbath day and perform their duties? Absolutely. In other words, the priest had to work on the Sabbath day. One reference said it was their busiest day of the week. And yet they're blameless. In other words, they're not violating the Sabbath, even though they're technically working on the Sabbath day. And then he goes on to say, we'll go ahead and get the other differences here before we move on to Mark. That one is greater, that one who is greater than the temple is in their midst. And that's Jesus, of course. Jesus is greater than the temple, and he has authority. And then he mentions verse 7, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. In other words, I do remember one of the things that Mark's account references, and I'll just reference it. Mark chapter 2, I think it might be around verse 27, it mentions that, I just lost my thought. Desire mercy and not sacrifice. Oh, that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was supposed to be a blessing for man. And now the Pharisees were making it a burden. You see where I'm going with this? What was the purpose of God setting aside the seventh day as a day of rest? You remember how the Bible talks about that?
To rest.
To rest and to reflect on God. God, to reflect on God, blessing them. It was to be a day of reflection, a day of rest. But instead, they were turning it into all these rules and regulations that weren't even in the law of Moses. And so when Jesus in Mark's account, and again, I think the reference is Mark 2:27, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. In other words, again, the Sabbath was to be a blessing, not a burden. And this idea that I desire mercy and not sacrifice, that's quoting from Hosea 6:6. And the idea there is that if man is suffering on the Sabbath day, he is to relieve that suffering. And we're going to see that especially in this next instance with the man who's healed on the Sabbath day. But even as hunger, you have to satisfy hunger. God didn't intend for his people not to eat on the Sabbath day. I know you wouldn't necessarily refer to that as suffering, but God wanted them to take care of themselves. That's the point. All right. Any comments on this section? Thoughts?
I remember reading what you've been on the walk so far.
Yes.
Well, is this one of the so-called, I quote, made up ones from that's actually in the law?
It is actually long. We're not told how far they walked.
Right. We don't
Yeah.
know. These Pharisees, they could be playing hypocrite out, running around hunting down Jesus.
It would have been hard to keep up. Yeah.
I mean, just like you said, they're trying to just do whatever they can to nail Jesus.
Exactly. And you're going to see that especially in the second example. I saw another hand go up, Luke.
Eric previously on point.
Bill?
I looked up that reference that Mike was talking about in Exodus 29, 32, and 33. Aaron and his sons shall eat the ram and the bread that is in the basket by the door of the tabernacle of meeting, they shall eat those things which the atonement was made to consecrate and to sanctify them, but an outsider shall not eat them because they are holy. So yeah, only Aaron and his sons.
Yeah, only Aaron and his sons. And as Jesus reflects on that, comments on that, he says the priest only. So yeah, I think that's a pretty... But yeah, that would kind of answer your point with the silence of the Scriptures. That's a good argument for it. All right, let's go back to our account. Now, I want to leave you with this last thought. When Jesus claims he is Lord of the Sabbath, he is claiming he is the Messiah. He is claiming that he is deity. The implication is even that he is deity. And also the implication is that he is the one with the authority that has the right to interpret what is work and what is not work, not the Pharisees and their traditions. And again, you can't use this chapter to argue that under certain occasions we can break God's law. Jesus, we know, was sinless. Not only would he not break the law of Moses, he wouldn't condone anyone breaking the law of Moses. All right. Any other comments, thoughts?
Yeah, and
Luke?
adding to that, Jesus was found among sinners. And the Pharisees wouldn't do that.
Yeah. All right. Someone take verses 6 through 11. 6 through 11.
Now it happened on another Sabbath also that he entered the synagogue and taught. And a man was there whose right hand was withered. So the scribes and Pharisees watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, they might find an accusation against him. But he knew their thoughts, and he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Arise and stand here." And he arose and stood. And Jesus said to them, "I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy?" And when he had looked around at them all, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so. His hand was restored as whole as the other. But they were filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do with Jesus.
Thank you, Tim. This right here reveals their heart, doesn't it? This passage reveals the heart and the malice and the hypocrisy. It shows who really has the sin. And it's these Pharisees. Now here Jesus is in their den. If you look at Matthew's account, it said he went into their synagogue on the Sabbath day. The there are the Pharisees. But Jesus wasn't afraid. He didn't back down. He went where the people were. He went there to teach and to help and to instruct. And as we reflected on last week, it was his habit every Sabbath to be at the synagogue. That should teach us something, of course, about our own attendance. But he made it a habit. And here we see him in the Sabbath, in the synagogue, or on the Sabbath in a synagogue. And it says there was a man who had a right hand who was withered. Now, we can only wonder, we can only let it be in the realm of opinion, but was this man usually there? Maybe so. Or was he there because the Pharisees had brought him there? Were they testing him? Were they trying to catch him? We're not told. I wouldn't put it past them. But notice verse 7, they watched him closely. I have a cat at home. I almost called him a little cat. He's not little. But I'll watch him sometimes. If there's something he's after, his eyes get big and he crouches down and he's waiting to pounce. Maybe you've seen that with lions and other wild cats in a documentary. He's watching his prey. Well, here we see that the predators are these Pharisees. They weren't watching Jesus closely to learn. They were watching Jesus closely to catch. That's what we see here in the text. They watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath day so that they might find an accusation, some offense to accuse him of. Now notice it says that the man's right hand was withered. Your right hand is, for most people, your prominent hand. This man would have been most likely not able to work, not be able to work. And so this man is in a bad situation. And here they bring this man to Jesus to know whether or not he would heal on the Sabbath day. And I love how he turns it around. They're not the ones in control of the situation. He's the one in control. He uses this as an example to teach a lesson, as he often does. He tells the man, verse 8, by the way, I have it underlined in this note Bible that I have. He knew their thoughts. Now, I could try to guess your thoughts, but Jesus didn't guess, he knew. He knew their thoughts and said to the man who had the withered hand, "Arise and stand here." So this man is standing up in front of the whole crowd. He's using this man as a lesson to teach. And he says, "I'll ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil?" Now, what is the very first thing we learn about God in Genesis 1? What does it say after every one of God's acts? It was good. Is God for good? Yes. And so he asks the question, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath day or to do evil? To save life or to destroy? And again, if you go to Matthew's account, you go to Mark's account, it talks about how he uses the illustration. He said, if one of you has an animal, and on your way to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, let's say one of your animals trips and falls down into a pit. Will you not reach down and help that animal out of the pit? Of course they would. That was an acceptable practice on the Sabbath day. Kind of like with Ty's illustration about the elevator. You know, they can walk to the elevator, they just can't push the buttons. Well, they can lift somebody or a donkey. They can help a donkey on the Sabbath day, they just couldn't help a man. Now, what's so interesting? Does Jesus even touch this man? Look at the text. Stretch out your hand. The man stretched out his hand, and what happens? The man's hand was whole. Jesus didn't touch the man. He didn't even move closer. He didn't do anything. He just spoke. Can you not talk on the Sabbath day? Do you see the point I'm trying to make? Jesus didn't even do anything except say a few words. Now, what's also hypocritical about these Pharisees is that in their traditions, and this I verified this with a source, that they would allow, under circumstances where someone got hurt or sick, the doctor could come and do work. The doctor could come and try to help that person. You know, you could call the ambulance, in other words, on the Sabbath day. They accepted that. But here this man could be healed, but in their worldview, no, not on the Sabbath day. As a matter of fact, you're going to see later on, one of the rulers of one of the synagogues say, there are 6 days that men ought to work, come and be healed on those 6 days, not on the Sabbath day. Well, why not on the Sabbath day? Does God take the Sabbath day off? Does he stop caring for the world and caring for the birds and the creatures out in nature on the Sabbath? Of course not. He would actually make that argument in John's gospel that my Father works on the Sabbath day and I must work too. But notice their reaction. They were so happy. They recognized Jesus as the Messiah and they converted over and became his disciples. No, it says they were filled with rage because Jesus did good on the Sabbath day. And they discussed with one another what they might do with Jesus. Now, Luke is ambiguous on what that phrase means, what they might do with Jesus. But Mark's account, in Matthew's account, Matthew chapter 12, verse 14, it tells you what they meant by that. What they discussed how that they might destroy him. They were already plotting his death. And in Mark's account, Mark 3:6, it said that the Pharisees teamed up with the Herodians. Now, who are the Herodians? They were the sworn enemies of the Pharisees. But you see, the Herodians had political influence because they were aligned with Herod's family and with Rome. And if you want anything legal done, you had to get in with the Herodians. And so the Pharisees were making amends, or at least getting together with the Herodians for the sake of doing away with Jesus. And one more thing. Here's the whole point. Could Jesus heal on the Sabbath day if God did not approve of it? No. If Jesus was violating and doing work on the Sabbath day, he couldn't heal. But, of course, we see that he could and he did. Again, he's not violating, he's not breaking the law on the Sabbath day. They were not only does it show their disingenuous heart, but it also showed that they didn't really care about people. They didn't care about the greater things in the law, like mercy and helping people. Go ahead, Terry.
They didn't even care that a miracle was just performed.
Exactly.
there's no awe and wonder on a man restored whole right in front of them. Their hearts were so hard. And, you can like people that become that way into the church. And you try to do good for them. And their heart's so hard that they're just seen as evil.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a very good point. All right. Now, I didn't notice this until it was pointed out. And again, I want to give a shout out to the Truth for Today commentary. I forget his first name, but Brother Roper is the author of that commentary. He says it's no accident that the list for the disciples mentioned right after verse 11. Verse 11 basically says they had planned to kill him, meaning Jesus' days are numbered. Who would carry on Jesus' work after he left this earth? His apostles would. Now it came to pass in those days, verse 12, that he went out to the mountain to pray, and he continued all night in prayer to God. He's about to choose his apostles. Any important decision, really any decision we make, ought to be preceded by prayer. If it's important enough to worry about, it's important enough to pray about. And not only did he spend time in prayer, he spent all night in prayer. And then verse 13, and he went when it was day, and he called his disciples to himself. Disciple means a student, a follower, a learner. He called his disciples to himself, and from that pool of disciples, he chose 12 whom he named apostles. Now the term apostle means one who is sent, one who has a mission, one who is sent forth. Now that term came specifically to apply to these 12. But the Bible sometimes does refer to other people being an apostle, but it doesn't mean an apostle in the special sense of these 12 men. You got to distinguish. Even Jesus, I think in Hebrews, is called an apostle because he was sent on a mission by God. Later on in Acts, Barnabas is called an apostle, even though he wasn't one of these 12 special men selected for. So you got to understand what words mean when you read Scripture. But when we think of apostle, we mean it in the special way of these 12 men. Later on, Paul would be added to that group as well. We should distinguish that. And here's the list. You can find this list in four different places in the Bible, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and in Acts. Let's quickly go through this list. We're almost out of time. And from them he chose these 12, called apostles: Simon, whom he also named Peter, Andrew, his brother, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who also became a traitor. In every one of the lists, it's interesting that Peter's mentioned first and Judas is mentioned last. Terry did did a great job. Spent plenty of time talking about Peter being at the first of this list. No doubt Peter was a standout, in some good ways, some bad. But he no doubt was a leader to these men. And you see that his brother Andrew's mentioned with him. Now, you will see differences in the list. But those differences can be easily explained. For instance, it mentions Bartholomew here. Most likely, when you compare Bartholomew to what we read in John, what John says about the apostles, this is most likely Nathaniel. Just like Peter had two different names, Paul had two different names. It shouldn't be surprising to us that many of these men most likely had different names, nicknames, surnames, whatever you want to call them, more than one name. Matthew, as we saw last week, is also called Levi. I had a question about that after class. How do we know Levi is Matthew? Well, we know that Matthew was a tax collector. Levi was a tax collector. Matthew was called by Jesus at a tax booth by the Sea of Galilee. So was Levi. So when you compare all the accounts, there's no doubt it's talking about the same person. And so keep that in mind when you run across these differences. Go ahead, Luke, and I'll make a few more comments after yours, and we'll most likely wrap up class.
And looking at, Iscariot, that means traitor.
No.
It doesn't?
Doesn't. And most likely, I know in our minds it does, because today Iscariot does mean traitor, right?
So they labeled that later on?
Yes. Later on in our culture, an Iscariot came to mean a traitor. But most likely, I wondered about that too, most likely it came to refer to a town in Judea. Okay. Again, I don't know, that's something I read in a commentary.
But it's hard to find a definition of Iscariot.
Yes, it is. You're exactly right. But the commentary I referenced, and I left my notes at home, but most likely is referring to a town in Judea.
The inhabitants of Kirioth.
That's it. Exactly.
And I just knew that, by the way.
Oh, yes. I appeal to your great knowledge.
What did you say, Michael? I didn't hear.
The inhabitants of Kirioth.
And I know that that's in Judea. I get points too, right? I'll end with these comments on the apostles. If you look at Mark 3:14, it tells you why he chose these men. The first reason is to be with him. They would be 3.5 years, give or take, with Jesus. They would receive training. They would learn from his example. They would be his companions. Number 2, it mentions to preach. Can you do more preaching with one person or 12 people? I've heard it described before, taking a ray of light and putting it through a prism, and then that prism diffuses the light into many different rays of light. And of course, Jesus, in his infinite wisdom, and I can truly say in his infinite wisdom, knew what he was doing when he chose these 12 men. And then Mark 3:14 mentions to cast out demons. Let that be a synecdoche. In other words, let that represent all the miracles that they did. They did far more than just casting out demons. Jesus gave them the ability to heal and to do all sorts of miracles. And we know that those miracles would confirm their preaching. We know that those miracles would prove to people, because they didn't have copies of Scripture like we do. The Word had not yet been confirmed. Those miracles would prove beyond a doubt and give their word authority. By the world standards, they would have never chosen these 12 men. Peter? We would have never chosen men like that. But Jesus saw potential in these men. And he knew their hearts. And that gives me hope, because I think about my imperfections and all the weaknesses that I have. But I know that God can take those imperfections. And with his grace and with his power, he can use all of us in his kingdom. We can do great things. Each of these men had different talents and abilities that God could use. All right, we're going to leave off there. Next week, we're going to pick up with the Sermon on the Mount. Now, I will say that Matthew's account of the Sermon on the Mount has 107 verses. Luke's only has 30. We're going to go with Luke's. But the reason why is because the rest of Matthew's Sermon on the Mount is found in other places in Luke, with the exception of only 6 verses. So you find the teachings that you find in Matthew's version of the Sermon on the Mount, you find basically those same teachings in other places. So we're going to stick with Luke as our basis as we go through this study.